This video will discuss the stomach of the ruminant. This picture here is the left side of the stomach of a cow. Cranial aspect is to the left, caudal aspect is to the right, ventral at the bottom of the page, dorsal would be up here. And of the four compartments of the ruminant stomach, we have the reticulum, the rumen, the omasum, and abomasum. Ingesta will encounter those in that order. And from the left side, you can see the reticulum down here at B. The rumen is all of this. And we can see the abomasum peeking through from the other side right here. The omasum is not visible in this picture. When you look at the rumen, this compartment here, you can see depressions on the surface of it that kind of subdivide this thing exteriorly, and on the inside we'll have the same thing in there, but instead of a depression it will be a ridge of tissue. So these are called grooves out here. They will be called pillars or folds on the inside of this organ. The left longitudinal groove runs through here. That separates it into a dorsal component and a ventral component. And we have dorsal and ventral coronary grooves, and those will further subdivide the dorsal sac into its main portion and a caudal dorsal blind sac. Ventral sac down here, it sections off a caudal ventral blind sac. Further, if you look at this left longitudinal groove, it dives down into the page here as the caudal groove, and that caudal groove will reach the opposite side of the rumen. Right over here, there's a gap through here, and your cranial groove is running down through there. So this left longitudinal groove stops right here, and what you can see is there is a portion of the ventral sac in front of this area. There's a portion of the dorsal sac in front of that same area. These are not going to have nice grooves like the caudal aspect did, but what we will see is this portion of the ventral sac that extends cranially to this point here will be called the ruminal recess. It looks like it's a lowercase l right there. And this portion here is going to be called the cranial sac or the ruminal atrium. So the dorsal sac is going to end up with the dorsal sac proper here, a cranial sac and a caudo-dorsal blind sac. And the ventral sac here will have the ventral sac proper there, ruminal recess, and a caudo-ventral blind sac here. The reticulum will be located cranial to the rumen. And in the live animal, we've got the esophagus coming in here at O right there. The diaphragm will sit right here. Right there, diaphragm will be right in front of that thing. Dorsal abdominal cavity right here along the dorsal curvature of this rumen. The ventral aspect of the abdominal cavity right here along the ventral aspect. This rumen will occupy the entire left side of the abdominal cavity. From the diaphragm, dorsal abdominal cavity, ventral abdominal cavity, and this region back here with the blind sacs will come back to the pelvic inlet. So it occupies the entire left side of the abdominal cavity and will push viscera and the left kidney and the liver over towards the right side of that abdominal cavity. Looking at the ruminant stomach from the right side, we see once again, now the cranial aspect of this will be to the right of your picture, caudal aspect back here, and dorsal again, the top, ventral at the bottom. Esophagus coming in here at O. We see the reticulum at the cranial end of this stomach. Here's our rumen over here. And now on the right side, we can see this spherical omasum, and just ventral and caudal to that, our abomasum that has the shape of the typical stomach that you're used to seeing in the dog and the horse, with a greater curvature and lesser curvature here, pylorus, body, all those salient parts. So here are the four regions of the stomach now: reticulum, rumen, omasum, and abomasum. Reticulum's at B, rumen's at A, omasum and abomasum there. Here is our right longitudinal groove here between the dorsal and ventral sacs. Going down this gap right here, this is where your caudal groove is, connecting the back end of the right longitudinal groove to the back of the left longitudinal groove. And right here at D, this is where our cranial groove cuts across from right to left, connecting the cranial ends of both of those longitudinal grooves. Now if you go back to this picture here, imagine taking a knife and cutting longitudinally down this thing this direction here. We would get something that looks like this, and here it is inside the animal. So now you can see the inside of these chambers. Here's our dorsal sac of the rumen here, ventral sac here, reticulum's right up here. So our caudal ventral blind sacs, caudal ventral there, caudal dorsal blind sac here, you can see those sectioned off by this pillar now. It was a groove on the outside, on the inside it's a prominence, so it's called a pillar. This is the caudal pillar. Right longitudinal pillar is right in through here. Cranial pillar comes over here out of the page addis, and the left longitudinal would have been over here, and that's cut away. So this makes a circle right through here, these pillars. And that circular opening is called the intraruminal opening, and that is the passageway between the dorsal sac and the ventral sac of the rumen. So here's our cranial pillar there. So this little piece of the ventral sac that runs cranial to that kind of dips up underneath it. There's a ruminal recess, and over the top of it here, here's the cranial sac of the rumen right there. Cranial sac of the rumen looks a lot like the reticulum right here in shape and location, but it is caudal to it. The opening between those two structures is called the ruminoreticular orifice. This fold of tissue that comes up here that you've got to go across dorsally to get from the cranial sac of the rumen into the reticulum is called the ruminoreticular fold. So all these things back here will be called pillars. This is a fold right there. Right here you can see the esophagus coming into the rumen, and right at the bottom of that there is this channel that exists here in the reticulum. And what this is doing is these are two ridges of tissue, and in the neonate, when it begins suckling, these two ridges of tissue will touch one another and it ends up forming a tube, and that is the reticular groove coming through here. The whole thing's called the gastric groove. The first part's the reticulum will be the reticular groove. There's a part in the omasum called the omasal groove, and one in the abomasum called the abomasal groove. What that will do is this rumen is a big fermentation vat for all the cellulose containing material that these animals are ingesting. The milk, and especially that colostrum, does not need to be fermented and sitting around in any form or fashion. It needs to be shunted on down towards that abomasum. And so this groove will close up, shunt that milk away from the rumen into the omasum, through the omasum, into the abomasum, and will actually shoot through the abomasum on down into the duodenum. It's essential for that colostrum to get absorbed. It does not need to be broken down before it gets down to do its job. So you're going to see a reticular groove up here, the first part of the gastric groove, and it'll be a little bit easier seen in the plastinated specimens. The other thing you'll notice is with this reticulum sitting just behind the diaphragm, it's separated from the heart only by the pericardial sac and that diaphragm sitting right there. Now these ruminants will tend to chew on stuff they shouldn't be chewing on, and they'll ingest pieces of metal, pieces of baling wire, pieces of barbed wire fence, sharp pieces of metal that they don't need to be eating, but they will. When they ingest these things, when it comes in here, what will happen is there is a fluid line sitting through here. The gas will be at the top. All this down here will be fluid, and all of the vegetative matter that they are ingesting. So when this piece of metal comes in here and it hits this fluid sac, it will sink immediately and it will fall down into this reticulum. Now, as this animal is going about life and this rumen is contracting and relaxing and contracting and pushing all this stuff around, those contractions can take a piece of metal and push it through the wall of the organ, and if it runs out the reticulum in a cranial direction, it will pierce through the diaphragm, pierce through the pericardial sac, and pierce on into the heart and cause problems with the heart, contractility of it, various other factors, and this is what they term hardware disease. So what farmers will do is they will stick a magnet down into the mouth of the cow. Cow will swallow it, drops down into here. First gravity dependent region it hits, it will sit down in this reticulum, and subsequent to that, any piece of metal that comes in will stick to that magnet so that it will not be able to leave the reticulum and pierce out into other parts of the body. So you'll have these little ruminal magnets that'll sit down here actually in the reticulum to keep that metal from migrating out, and especially keeping it away from that heart. This is a picture. It's a cross section of the omasum, and these are actually sheets. They're going down into this picture like this, varying lengths. So it's like the pages of a book. It's like you've taken a book and open it up and looking at the top of the book down the top of the page. Here is our omasal groove here. It's the ventral aspect with nothing in the way. So that part of the gastric groove that's shunning that colostrum and milk on down towards the lower GI tract will pass through this region here. What this is doing in the adult animal is this is working as a pump. We've got the big rumen as our fermentation vat, and all of that chewed up grass, they chew their cud and they grind it up and grind it up and grind it up until it's just a sludge. It's very, very thick, and this is the pump that pumps that from the rumen where it's been fermented to where the animal can use the byproducts of that fermentation, pumps it into the abomasum that is the true stomach of this ruminant, to where digestion can begin and all the gastric acids will come out and work their magic on this stuff. So this is the pump between the fermentation vat and that true glandular stomach that we saw in the dog and the horse. Okay, this right here is a plastinated goat stomach. You can see the esophagus here entering the cranial end of this stomach. So cranial is here, caudal's here, dorsal here, ventral down here. This is the reticulum, the first component of that four-chamber stomach that this ruminant has. First thing it enters. Here's the rumen back over here. Left longitudinal groove doesn't show too well here. These are some things that you really need to come back in and see when you get back to school. Dorsal sac here, this little pouch right here, there's our cranial sac of the rumen. Caudal-dorsal blind sac. The small ruminant, the sheep and the goat, don't really have much of one of those. You'll see that in the cow, but they do have the caudal-ventral blind sac back here. So this is our ventral coronary groove right there. The caudal groove is this groove right here between the dorsal sac of the rumen and this caudal-ventral blind sac there. And this is abomasum sneaking over here greatly. It doesn't really sit like this in the live animal, but remember, this has been plastinated and altered by human hand. Coming around over here, this is our right longitudinal groove through here. Caudal groove was back there. Cranial groove is buried down here. Here's the esophagus once again. You can see the reticulum up here cranially now. Now here is our omasum in the goat. Here's our abomasum here. Abomasum will have the same little fundus area, body, pylorus, and then we got pyloric sphincter being here, and we'll get on into our duodenum there. Now in the cow, the omasum is extremely large. It'll be larger than the reticulum. In the small ruminant, it will be smaller than the reticulum. So this will be a lot larger in our cow. So this is the outside of this thing right here. And let's take this and we're going to cut down here and look at the inside of this thing. Okay, here's the inside right here. Now this is darker here because we have our epithelium still in place. This lighter place out of here, it's all peeled away. That was part of the plastation process where it let loose. So we're looking at the tunica muscularis down here. The submucosa mucosa is still on up here. I will show you what these things look like, the surface of them closer up using another camera in another portion of the video, but you'll notice differences in these if you can see it on your computer. So anyway, what we've got here, once again, our esophagus is coming in here. Here's our reticulum here cranially. That's what the white pin is in. You can see this little reticular groove right here, those two ridges of tissue. You can see that there. Here's our abomasum peeking in from underneath. This is our right longitudinal pillar there. It comes up here. This is our caudal pillar there. This is our cranial pillar here with the red pin in it. The left longitudinal pillar would have been here. So this is our intraruminal recess between the dorsal and ventral sacs. This is our caudal pillar here. Here's our caudal groove back here with this little pink pin in it. This is the right ventral coronary pillar, separating off this caudoventral blind sac from the rest of that ventral sac of the rumen. If this is our cranial pillar here, here's that piece projecting cranial to it on the ventral aspect. So here's our ruminal recess here. Here's our ventral sac proper over here. Dorsal sac here, there's no coronary pillar here and the small ruminant separating off a caudal dorsal blind sac, so we just call this dorsal sac. And then over the top of this cranial pillar, here's our cranial sac of the rumen right in here. If we look at the other side of this, actually let's look at another one here. Here's another one that has all the mucosa and submucosa still intact. I think I'll have you label this one. Anyway, one of the things you will see on here, the spleen is tightly adhered to the rumen. This is a piece of spleen up here. It was off of the other specimens there. I will show you some close-ups of the inside of the mucosa on these specimens here. Now if we turn this over and look at the other side, the right side, this is what we're looking at here. Here's our dorsal sac up here at the green pin, our right longitudinal groove. Esophagus is coming in here at the orange pin right there. Here's the reticulum down here. And now from that reticulum, that gastric groove is running from the reticulum through this bottom portion of the omasum, down through the abomasum, all the way down towards the duodenum to get that colostrum right on down, ready for absorption where it needs to be. So looking in here, you can see these sheets of tissue in here in this pump that we call the omasum. It comes down into the abomasum, and these are not called rugae like they were in the dog. In the dog, when all those undulations inside the stomach would flatten out once the stomach filled up with food, in the abomasum, these will always be present like this. They do not ever flatten out. So these are permanent structures in the abomasum, longitudinal folds. Another thing you'll notice in the ruminant, down here at the pyloric sphincter, on the lesser curvature side, there is a bulge of tissue bulging into the lumen. This is called the torus pyloricus. What this is there for is the pyloric sphincter is not as strong in the ruminant, and the pig has this as well. So in the dog and the horse, the pyloric sphincter was a circle, and it would close off and close the entire thing to keep the contents in the stomach until it's time to release it. In the ruminant and the pig, it's not strong enough to close all the way down, so we have this torus pyloricus that is a bulge of tissue that reduces that lumen from a circle into a crescent. So when that pyloric sphincter needs to close down, it just barely closes down right there, and we have that walled off. And now all the contents of the abomasum are kept in place, and when it relaxes, it comes back to this fashion here. So that torus pyloricus is not a tumor, it's not a growth, it is a normal bump of tissue on the lesser curvature side of that pyloric region that will help close that channel off. And you can see that channel right there, like a dark little line through there. It's not a big open space, it's a dark little line. Okay, here we are back at our rumen, and I want to show you the lining of these organs. The reticulum, the rumen, and the omasum are aglandular. They've got stratified cornified epithelium on them. These are just basically storage containers. Reticulum is there, part of the fermentation vat, and it's in a nice position to catch heavy objects entering the stomach that don't belong there. Rumen is there for fermentation, so there's no glandular secretions that need to be coming out for digestion or anything at that point. And the omasum on the other side will be aglandular as well, because it's just working as a pump. It's the abomasum that will have the glandular epithelium on it. So when you look in here, we've got this nice brown color on these, lining these organs here. If you take a look at it, we call this reticulum because it's got a reticular pattern in there, and you can see that. Tall ridges of tissue in there. It's got its own unique architecture, separate from the omasum and the rumen, and maybe you'll get to see that in your microanatomy course. When you get into the rumen, we have little like tongue-like or little leaf-like papilla in here, all over the place. You'll see the same thing. I'm sorry, it's different than what you see in the reticulum over here. But these little papilla all over right there, that's its own little unique design. And if we flip this over and look at the omasum, again, you will see that dark colored or keratinized material or cornified material there with little bumps all over it, small little projections on those different sheets, lamina in there. And if you come down into the abomasum, you will notice it's a different color and smooth. This is our glandular epithelium down here. Okay, different color than that right there. Different color than what we had over here. So the reticulum, rumen, omasum are aglandular. Abomasum is our true glandular stomach. While we're talking about stomachs, I want to show you this pig stomach here. We mentioned that torus pyloricus in the pylorus of the cow and the ruminant. You can see the same thing here in the pig. The greatest thing of note is this region over here. You can see the esophagus coming in here. You see our fundic region over here, the body of the stomach here, and the pyloric region here, and on into the duodenum over here. So it looks like our typical dog, pretty close to typical dog stomach, horse stomach. But over here in this fundic region, there is a stricture right here, and there is a diverticulum over here, a gastric diverticulum. And if I roll this over, you can see it right over here. It's a separate little pocket. Doesn't have any purpose there. If anything, it adds more volume to it, Just wanted you to be aware that the pig does have this little gastric diverticulum right there, so you do not think it's some type of aneurysm or blowout or tumor. So gastric diverticulum in the pig right there.